This is Intercepted. From Dropsite News, I'm Jeremy Scahill. Well, this has been a very, very intense several weeks. Donald Trump is now the president-elect. Joe Biden, even though he has only a couple of months remaining in office, has given the green light to Ukraine to start using long-range missiles to strike inside of Russian territory. The Israeli state is continuing its scorched earth genocidal war against the people of Gaza. Several of Trump's nominees for key national security positions are officials and people that believe that Israel should have been given more weapons, more support from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. There are very, very dire issues facing the world right now, and a lot of it rotates around who is going to be in power in the United States. And so I wanted to take a deep dive to look at some of the figures that Donald Trump has nominated to serve in defense, in intelligence, to be the ambassador to Israel, the ambassador to the United Nations, and also to take a close look at what Trump's election means for Iran, what it means for Russia and Ukraine and the war there, what it means for the people of Palestine and for Israel's war. Joining me now to do that is Kelly Vlahos. She is a senior advisor for the Quincy Institute and the editorial director at Responsible Statecraft. Kelly, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Happy to be here.
So let's just begin with the very, very broad, big picture of what we understand based on Trump's first term and then what he said in during the course of the past 4 years and specifically leading up to his victory in the 2024 election. How would you describe what Donald Trump has articulated as his vision for foreign policy, for defense policy, and combine that with some of his initial selections for his national security, defense, and intelligence team?
Wow. I think I would be lying to you if I told you that I knew what Trump's vision was. I typically go back to his 2016 speech where he articulated a foreign policy vision for the United States of restraint. And he was specifically criticizing the global war on terror, the nearly 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the fact that we had gone to war in Iraq based on a lie about weapons of mass destruction, the stretching thin of our military, and he knew at that moment that Americans were tired of war. His particular constituency in the red states had been sending their men and women, their daughters and sons into war in cyclical deployments for years. So he had really tapped into obvious disenchantment with Washington war policy at that moment. And this was widely embraced by his own base and by Republicans outside of Washington, but also the realism and restraint community, people like myself, who I am quite independent in terms of my political affiliations, and much of my inspiration, the passions with which I work are based on getting out of endless wars and regime change wars overseas. So this kind of inspired a lot of folks, even conservatives as well as anti-imperialists on the left, and in thinking that perhaps we had turned a corner. Now, I don't think he's completely abandoned any of that. His first term, though, was fraught. He had brought in neocons like Mike Pompeo, for example, hawks like John Bolton, and it really muddied the waters. Nikki Haley had brought to bear a lot of the neoconservative elements that wanted to get rid of the JCPOA, the deal with Iran that hemmed in their nuclear program. And it was a mixed bag, at the very least, a mixed bag. He has sort of re-engineered his views about war and foreign policy in this second term, talking more about peace through strength. And even towards the end, he did bring back some of those elements about not getting into foreign wars. He promised Arab American voters that he would bring peace to the Middle East. More specifically, he's promised to end the war in Ukraine, which has become an issue mostly on the right and among realists and restrainers like myself at the Quincy Institute, to get that war to an end through negotiations and an acknowledgement that fighting militarily is not going to resolve the issues between Ukraine and Russia. We'd have taken a lot of heat for that from the left side of our dial. But the right and Republicans have sort of brought that mantle of ending unconditional aid for Ukraine. So he's promised that too. And so, again, a mixed bag, because on Israel and Iran, he's been super hawkish, very supportive of Israel, though he's been quite vague about how he wants them to finish the job in Gaza and Lebanon. So fast forward to day after election, he starts fire hosing with his picks for foreign policy. And frankly, it's been a little bit of a disappointment to realists and restrainers who had been with him since 2016, believing that he was going to bring a new vision of foreign policy to bear. He is instead nominated Marco Rubio, who is a neoconservative of longstanding, very pro-Israel, very anti-Iran, has very hawkish views on Latin American policy, which we could talk about more. But I mean, if putting him in the slot of the top diplomat is not a good sign for restraint. And continue that with Pete Hegseth, his nominee for Secretary of Defense, who claims to be a reformed neocon of 6 years, but there's not a lot of evidence of what his worldview is beyond supporting the pardoning of war criminals. And then you can go on from there. Mike Huckabee as U.S. ambassador to Israel, who does not believe in a two-state solution, who thinks there's no such thing as a Palestinian, and his appointment of Elise Stefanik to the UN as UN ambassador. She is obviously a very anti-Iran, pro-Israel candidate of longstanding, who spent the last several months dragging university professors to Capitol Hill to harangue them about not cracking down on anti-Semitism in university protests. That's how she basically made her name of late. So not a lot of promise there that there is consistency from the Trump administration in terms of what it means by restraint, getting us out of foreign entanglements, maybe with Ukraine, but not so much with Israel. So we can talk more about the specifics of these picks. Tulsi Gabbard, actually a bright point, I would say, but she's getting attacked from all sides. So it is not even clear whether she can be confirmed yet. And to go back to your original question, I don't have a clear view of what his doctrine, so to speak, is. I would say maybe Jacksonian in a sense that he really supports a strong military, is willing to use it, but is not interested in democracy building or pursuing wars that are ideological in nature that I can see so far. He's more of a transactional president and will use the military and throw the weight of American power around when he sees fit, but does not necessarily agree with regime change for democracy promotion, nation building, or recasting the rest of the world in America's image.
You know, on the issue of Ukraine, which, as you noted, has become a very, very big issue for Republicans opposing this. And it's, of course, there is a cynical tie to the Hunter Biden storyline of the past several years, and the impeachment and the Russiagate business. It's not all about these Republicans necessarily being pro-Russia because they think that Russia's geopolitical position is one that they agree with. There is a cynical layer of politics to this, in the same way that the Democrats have really fanned this notion that we're in the midst, that the Soviet Union is rising again, that Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard are sleeper agents for a Soviet plot to destroy America from within. But for those of us that actually follow this on a policy level, there have been some really serious developments in recent days where you have the Biden administration, lame duck administration, just lost the election, months left in that presidency, greenlighting Ukraine being able to fire long-range missiles provided by the United States inside of Russia. And the day after this was announced on Monday, you had the first set of reported strikes of the Ukrainians using these long-range weapons. What's at play here? This strikes me as something quite, unless there was a meeting between Biden and Trump on this issue, which is possible, where Biden informed Trump he was going to do this, although there's indications that didn't happen. This is Biden doing something that is a quite significant escalation, and one that Vladimir Putin has personally said he would consider a red line being crossed, just weeks before a change of power in the United States to an administration that has said it's going to take U.S. policy in a different direction.
I mean, it's been no secret that the Biden administration, members of Congress in the leadership on both sides, Democrat and Republican, the EU and NATO have been aiming to Trump-proof the Ukraine war policy for months. And that includes making sure that they have the Pentagon authorities to continue to send weapons through the rest of the year, all the way through inauguration. The EU and NATO have pledged billions of dollars to Ukraine, which Ukraine may or may not have to pay back. And that depends on whether the interest from the Russian assets can actually come into play here. We don't even know that yet. So they may have pledged and given money to Ukraine that it won't be able to pay back for years. And we know how terrible their economy is, only because they want to make sure that Trump can't turn off the spigot when he gets into office. So that extends to the military policy and the weapons, and Biden allowing for the use of these long-range missiles deep into Russia. And so I'm not surprised that Biden has done this right after the election, but it seems to me that there is political implications here, and I don't get a sense that the adults are in the room actually talking about what the repercussions of this are. I see such Trump hate and such aversion to alternative thinking on Ukraine that they're doing things that are wildly escalatory at this point. I was listening to C-SPAN this morning, where two experts were brought in to talk about the Trump foreign policy, one clearly on the neocon right, the other clearly in the centrist international left, and both agreed that Trump's views on Ukraine were wildly outside of convention, that we had to support Ukraine at all cost. We have to support NATO at all cost. And it seemed to me, particularly from the woman who was representing the centrist left, that a lot of her thinking was informed by this real anger that Trump had won the election. And what bothers me most about this is that there are very smart people, very well-informed people, experts on Russia, history, military strategy, European affairs, who say this war is lost by Ukraine. And every day that we continue to support this idea of a military solution, we are destroying Ukraine a little more. And that if we really want to see a democratic free state flourish there, we need to bring this thing to the table. Whatever you think about Vladimir Putin and the invasion in 2022, it's not going to get resolved on the battlefield. They are losing, and they are losing their future. And what bothers me is I feel like what you had suggested, Jeremy, is that the political infusion, this idea that Trump has been a Putin puppet, and all of the trappings of Russiagate and the overlay of that whole issue onto this has clouded thinking. And we are willing to sacrifice Ukraine to get the better of Trump in domestic politics here in the United States. And that is just an anathema to me.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what the U.S. policy has consisted of during the tenure of Joe Biden as president, and we're going to talk in a bit about Palestine, about Gaza, Israel, West Bank, but sticking with Ukraine for a moment, I mean, the Democrats come back to power after Biden defeats Trump. And since the 2016 election, the entire narrative, the political narrative of the Democrats about Trump was embracing like a Cold War espionage novel, masquerading as a presidential campaign, the way that they talked about Donald Trump. And many of the most salacious major league allegations that were made about Trump, there was never any evidence produced to back it up. And I think that's part of why the Democrats found themselves floundering to try to figure out what their narrative was anymore, because so many people just rejected it or felt like they were inundated with something, and then facts just never quite materialized. I know that there are people out there that think that the PP tape is still there and that, the whole thing is going to be vindicated. But it wasn't just a political narrative against Trump. It also informed this ultra hawkish policy toward Russia. I'm sorry, but I think that's just a fact now, like that you can clearly back up with evidence that part of what happened here is that the Democrats painted a picture of a world in which Donald Trump was colluding with Vladimir Putin to overthrow democracy in the United States. And therefore, I don't even think it was about concern for Ukraine in terms of the primary motivation here. I think it was the Russiagate, Hillary Clinton narrative bleeding into American foreign policy in a very real way. And so now we have a situation where those people, and you were among them, I was among them, who were saying at the very beginning of this, when Russia was about to invade Ukraine, that this is going to result in a mass killing of many, many Ukrainians, of a destruction of large parts of Ukraine's infrastructure, probably of loss of territory to the Ukrainians, if you don't find a diplomatic solution to this. The idea that in the year 2022, 2023, 2024, that the United States is going to engage in a proxy war that in an instant could become a hot war with another massive nuclear power in the world was lunacy to engage in. And this says nothing about, people don't care about the people of Ukraine. No, part of the motivation for that is that you actually do care about the people of Ukraine. At the same time, Trump is a transactional guy. He is open to making spur of the moment rash decisions. He clearly still has neocons in his orbit that he has put now into his administration. And so I don't think it's a slam dunk that Donald Trump is going to end up serving Putin's agenda in Ukraine or elsewhere. Zelensky's video response after he talked to Trump, it seemed like those two had a conversation that Zelensky felt good about. Yes, you could say, well, it's like a hostage video. Remember, Trump wrapped Zelensky up in his whole impeachment thing. That Trump has his own sort of track of a relationship with him. But what I'm getting at here is that we now have a moment where Donald Trump at least has said he wants to end that war. And I'm not certain it's going to be ended in a way that is entirely to the benefit of Russia. In fact, it might be. I often say, I've made very clear what I think about Donald Trump. I don't want Donald Trump to be our president, but I also believe in being honest about policies and politics. And my sense is that there is a way in which Trump may have an ability to resolve this in a way that Biden wouldn't, because of the full-on embrace of the Cold War narrative of Russia and China are now it's like in the middle of the 1980s or 70s.
Yeah, it may even be worse than that. Because of the language that Biden, his administration, his supporters and surrogates in the media have used to describe Putin as the modern day Hitler, it's hard to reverse course at that point and say, well, let's sit down and talk to Hitler. And so they've created a facade here, a Manichaean facade of good versus evil. And like you said, they are fully locked into the trappings of that narrative. And so it's difficult. And they're still using it, by the way. Minutes after the election, I was still watching MSNBC and CNN and toggling back and forth. It was clear that Trump had won. And you already had folks like Rachel Maddow and Joy Reid out there saying that Trump's embrace, hug, in-line connection with Putin was going to be a national security, not even a national security. I think Joy Reid used the phrase global security threat. So they're already re-embracing the Russiagate, this idea that he is a proto-dictator, proto-autocrat who hangs out with other autocrats, and this sort of good versus evil, democracies versus autocracies framework. It's like you said, it'll be difficult for a Biden. It would be difficult for a Biden administration or anybody inside of it to start saying, "Well, let's sit down," like two parties need to on both sides of a conflict, and start hammering out negotiations, a negotiated peace. And like I do think it'd be easier for a Trump to come in and do that because he's never called Putin Hitler, and he's always called for talking to resolve this conflict. Whether you
what's amazing is that
he,
Donald Trump's own vice president compared him to Hitler, but yeah,
and then took it back.
Right. I mean, there's we could do a whole slew of discussing what Trump's cabinet appointees have said about him. But your point is taken. I mean, that there is, and the same I think is true in a way about the situation with Israel, in that there is nothing I've been saying for a long time, Biden could have ended this with one phone call, and I think that is factually accurate because we've seen it happen before, and we know that Biden never used any of the major tools available to an American president to alter policy, especially of an ally whose military operations you're underwriting, whose arms you're providing, whose political support you're offering, and whose legal cover you're bankrolling. But Trump, on the other hand, if there's a huge if here, because I think I am disgusted with what we're seeing coming out of Trump world on the issue of Israel, Gaza, etc. But as you mentioned, Trump did go to Dearborn, something that Harris didn't do. He did make the promises that you're saying. He told people, I'm gonna end this war, and then he turns around. He puts Mike Huckabee in as his ambassador, who is an insane, fanatical Christian Zionist who has made every possible kind of claim about the Palestinians and about Israel's actions that should outrage any Americans, any Palestinians, any people of the world that actually do want peace in that region. His major bankroller, to the tune of $100 million, was Miriam Adelson, who wants all Palestinian land annexed. You've had Trump saying that Biden was essentially keeping Netanyahu and Israel on a leash, and that that Netanyahu should be able to finish the job, which presumably means taking away any remnant of Palestinian life or people in Gaza and then turning your sights onto the West Bank. But the reality is that for a year plus, the Biden administration has facilitated a genocidal war in Gaza, has empowered Netanyahu further, and has done it while presenting themselves as a easily humiliated entity by Netanyahu. And you have people like Anthony Blinken and others who should go down in history now as some of the most belligerent, hawkish, bloodthirsty diplomats to serve in any administration. But for people looking for any kind of a shift in Trump, I was telling them, you're wrong if you think that Trump is somehow going to be the man of peace when it comes to Israel. But there's a transactional aspect of this that may be the only hope, which is that Trump decides this isn't good for his presidency. I mean, it's sick that we have to talk about that, but that is one possibility there. Setting that aside, my God, Kelly, look at these people that he's put in office and their positions on Israel, including Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard, who I've interviewed, whose career I've covered, her posture when it comes to Israel is that the Biden administration didn't go far enough, that Biden was afraid of being called an Islamophobe, that people protesting against the war were violent mobs who were being controlled and manipulated by Hamas. She has conflated Hamas with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. She has, and it's just flat out false, claimed that Hamas's end goal is to create a Islamic caliphate in the world. You can say a lot of things about Hamas, but you can't say that they have been targeting any entities other than those that are in Israel and Palestine. And so to have her, yes, she has anti-interventionist background. Yes, she's caused controversy for her position on Syria, her position on Russia. She's spoken against forever wars, but she's also been very clear that she supports drone strikes, that she does consider herself a hawk when it comes to fighting what she calls terrorism, and she has embraced an aspect of the neocon agenda as it was articulated post 9/11 about Islam and the notion that you go to war militarily with an ideology. So even the person that I think some anti-interventionists would go to and say, well, Tulsi Gabbard's going to be a force that kind of disrupts the dark side if she gets into the position of director of national intelligence. When it comes to Israel, she's just like the rest of them, and in some ways worse because she carries some credibility with the anti-interventionist crowd, whether they're on the left or right in the United States. So, I mean, we could talk about Tulsi for a moment, but to me, there's an important symbolism here for everyone to understand who was hoping for something different in this administration, that the one person that you could point to and say, that is a potential outsider in the mix here, an antigen being injected into the system. We've seen her increasingly become a Fox News talking head in many of her positions. And on this issue of Israel, there is a dime's worth of difference between her and some of these hawkish neocon types that Trump has installed.
What I'm thinking here is that we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Tulsi as a major Trump foreign policy pick if she didn't have those views or express those particular views during the campaign. I think looking at the swath of his nominees and appointments over the last week, the major through line is Israel and Iran. And I think each of those people were chosen specifically because they were going to do the bidding of Israel and a hawkish neoconservative perspective on Capitol Hill and in Washington. And those are, I mean, that to me, it's depressing, but that is the reality. And if people aren't recognizing that for what it is, I feel bad for them because we are being led down a certain path here. You mentioned Miriam Adelson. $100 million contributed to Trump's PAC. You think she's not waiting to get something back from that? And so you look at these picks. You look at Pete Hegseth. This guy has gone to Jerusalem and has advocated for the third temple to be built on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He is what you would call the Christian evangelical Zionist. He's right there. And everyone's talking about how he's underqualified. He's got a funny tattoo. He's been an alley cat. Might have had issues with a sexual assault complaint against him, and they're focusing on that, his lack of management experience. I look at the fact that he is out there talking about the third temple, which is supposed to hail the return of Jesus Christ and the end times, as maybe the most problematic part of his resume. And then I look at, like you mentioned, Mike Huckabee, full on, doesn't even acknowledge that Palestinians exist. And Mike Walz, again, willing to go to war with Iran. He might have a more conventional hawkish perspective. Marco Rubio was groomed by neoconservatives from the very beginning of his career. He had major pro-Israel donors basically lifting him up, giving his wife a job, getting him a sinecure at the university when he was out of office, and helping his Senate campaign. And he has pledged to support Israel against Iran at all costs. So we can go on and on with the rest of his picks, but that's the through line for me. So I think Tulsi had to make a concerted decision at some point when she was trying to get into the Trump orbit, that she had to dramatically shift her language. Now, you'll point out she has always been in support of drone strikes. She's always had this very hawkish perspective about Islam, but this pronounced support for Israel, I only see after October 7th. Hey, maybe she had a personal conversion over what happened after October 7th, but, just doing a little background.
I'll push back a little bit on that. You're right in the sense that she said that October 7th, that it was a mistake that October 7th wasn't viewed as a wake-up call that radical Islamist ideology poses the greatest threat to U.S. and global security, which is, just an outrageously false statement, given all of the threats in the world. So I think there's some support for her to at least make the claim that you just said. But if you go back, she has a very mixed record on these issues. She's taken a position against settlements at times, which also was Biden's one carve out in his criticisms of Israel. But when it came to kind of Israeli militarist posture, this has been with her for many, many years. So I think there's truth to what you're saying, but I do think that you can look at a through line of Gabbard's views on Islam and link it to this trajectory where she ends up saying we're not going far enough in our support of the extermination of Gaza.
Yeah. I'm like you, I've met Tulsi, I've interviewed her. I do feel like much of her perspective, her views on the 20-year war with Iraq and Afghanistan, the global war on terror, and her involvement in it as a soldier are coming from a real place. And when I had first covered her for, in my own reporting, it was when she was going up against the VA on burn pits. And she struck me as a very authentic advocate for veterans, and a veteran who used her own experience in the conflict to inform her broader view of U.S. foreign policy in a very positive way, which is different from Pete Hesketh, who, when he got out of the war, immediately formed an organization to keep surging troops back into the wars, and
and was campaigning for John McCain, and
we have those two types of veterans on Capitol Hill. She struck me as the good type. So I can't really explain her views on Israel specifically. I just have appreciated what she has brought to the table in terms of diplomacy over militarism. When she talks about the war in Ukraine, for example, she didn't have to go and visit Bashar Assad and come back and say, hey, yeah, I visited him. I think we should speak to him because I don't think, using a pretext of his chemical attacks and what's happening there in the Civil War for the United States to get into another regime change conflict is correct, because I just fought in a war like that and I don't want to see any more of those. And so I really appreciated her contribution to that conversation over the last several years. And I've stuck up for her when she's taken the slings and arrows over that visit to Syria, as well as her exhortations about diplomacy and not war in Ukraine. And she's been called a Russian agent, just like everybody else who have had an alternate view on that war. And so I'm kind of willing to give her more of a break, but I with you am distressed on the Israel stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wrote a story for Dropsite about her where I tried to dig into some of the complexities of this, and in fairness, I mean, I can point out all sorts of things about her past positions on Israel that I think led us to this point where she's saying, President Biden won't even say the words, radical Islamist terrorism, which was something that she also said about Barack Obama. And we can talk about her ties to far-right Hindu nationalist groups and the politics there, including, ones that are very, very bigoted and advocate, really heinous things toward Muslims in general. Like there is that strand of it. On the other hand, she introduced legislation trying to get Julian Assange and Edward Snowden pardoned. She has offered a critique of the forever wars that I think had that perspective been listened to earlier, especially from someone who was a veteran that served in one of those forever wars in Iraq and also served in several of the in zones of several of the proxy wars that the U.S. was waging under Obama. That things would be different in the Middle East if the U.S. was governed. So there are elements of her where if that Tulsi Gabbard shows up, then there could be some really interesting shakeup that occurs within the intelligence community. I'm just saying that I think that there's questions of how fully she's converted into the caricature on Fox News, and I think it's a question we're going to have to monitor if she does in fact get confirmed. We don't have much time, but I there's a couple things I want to make sure I ask you about. You mentioned Iran a few times. Trump is very aggressive in how he talks about Iran. It's interesting that the Iranian government and state media did not respond with hysteria to Trump's election and indicated that they felt that the time had run its course with Biden and the Democrats, and that they don't think that they'll be able to make a real deal. So they expressed, a desire to reopen talks with Trump. Trump has said contradictory things, including that he wants to make a comprehensive deal with Iran, and yet he piles in all of these people for as nominees to run his policy that are unrepentant Iran war hawks who want regime change and a military solution to confronting Iran.
Yeah, to me, the people that he appointed or nominated are, if they had their druthers, we'd be in war with Iran within a year on behalf of Israel. I don't think it's that cut and dry with Trump. I mean, if you recall, yes, he greenlighted the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. But from what we understand now, it was at the behest or the prodding of Mike Pompeo, a very terrible pick on his in his first administration. And he was counseled by none other than Tucker Carlson after that to not retaliate when the Iranians did a sort of pinprick retaliation. Yes, we had soldiers who had traumatic brain injuries after that, but it was a very limited retaliation. And all the hawks in the Trump administration are like, "Now we'll get them." And Tucker Carlson, I was on his show. It was the one and only time I was on Tucker Carlson. He brought me, Danny Davis, and Doug McGregor on Fox News that night to say why we shouldn't go to war with Iran. And so he listened to his better angels. And if you remember, he didn't attack Iran when Iran was accused of going after Saudi Arabian oil fields. And he did more than one time say, I want to talk. So it's a mixed bag with Trump. I just think that, again, he succumbs to donors like Miriam Adelson. He puts all of these anti-Iran hawks in his administration. It's going to be a battle for the next 4 years. Will he or won't he? Will he or won't he? And it's unfortunate for a lot of folks who are hoping that the pick of J.D. Vance, who has said he does not want to go to war with Iran, and it's not in our interest to go to war with Iran, would sort of lead the way, that he would bring in more realists and restrainers into the orbit. And it looks like the opposite will happen. Now, will J.D. Vance start populating his own staff with different types of foreign policy thinkers? There is some hope from that. And I don't know if that's copium that people in my circles are talking about. But at some point, we're going to have a shift away from all of these FDD-inspired people populating the centers of power.
This is the neocon think tank, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, just for people that don't follow these things. Last issue I want to talk to you about is if Trump takes power, he's got these guys that we've been talking about. A lot of the focus of his policy is on a foreign policy level is going to be Ukraine and Gaza. But also you have Latin American policy where Trump was far more hawkish and openly advocating, particularly economically, but also potentially militarily, intervention in Latin America. You had the targeting of Venezuela and the Maduro government under Trump. You had a great hostility toward Cuba, the region in general. Who's going to be running that? Which instincts are going to be at play? Is Trump just from day one immediately going to resume overt hostility towards several Latin American nations?
I mean, again, it's who he picked. Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is one of the biggest Latin America hawks to come down the pike. I mean, he has been awful on Cuba. He's been awful on Venezuela. If he is given that portfolio, we are going to see a dramatic shift. Now, you see a conflict at play here in Latin America between the right wing and the left wing, and there are several dynamics happening. And we saw Trump's embrace of some of these right-wing elements in his first administration. Will we see that, or will it be more transactional? Will Trump see opportunities for trade and perhaps embracing some of these Latin American leaders because of what they can bring him? Will he see the growth of relations of China and some of these Latin American countries, an opportunity or an impetus for us to get more involved in a less militaristic way? Will he take those lessons the right way? Or will he just let people like Marco Rubio, who have a clear ideological problem with the left-wing governments down there, take over? And then that could be an issue. I would actually like to see Trump, the transactionalist, the moneymaker, the deal maker, lead the charge down there, as opposed to Marco Rubio and some of these other folks who have real ideological impetus for cracking down and for embracing more right-wing elements down there. I would like to see our Cuba policy reversed. Now, Biden, if he wants to do anything good before he leaves, why doesn't he do that? Why doesn't he lift the travel ban and the embargoes in Cuba? I mean, Trump might come right back in and reverse it like he did when he replaced Obama. But, geez, there are so many opportunities there in Latin America that we are missing because of old Cold War ideologies.
Well, and Kelly, this would be for a whole other discussion, but Trump's the open pledge to do mass deportations and to hyper-militarize the border even further is also, I mean, there's the one issue of it, which is the way that immigrants are going to be targeted and treated under this administration, and we already know the plans are well in place for this. It's going to be the details we're going to have to see. There's talk of using the U.S. military as well, gravely concerning aspects of a overarching, really, really disturbing promised policy. But this will also impact the issues that we're talking about in Central and Latin America in a very, very serious way if you start to see these massive deportations happen. But we'll have to leave that for a different time. Kelly, thanks so much for being with us and offering your perspective.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Kelly Vlahos is a senior advisor for the Quincy Institute and the editorial director at the publication Responsible Statecraft. Make sure to go to dropsitenews.com to check out all of our reporting. We're doing some of the most in-depth reporting on the war against the Palestinians of Gaza and also in the West Bank of any news outlet you will find today. You can support our work by going to dropsitenews.com. And that does it for this episode. Intercepted is a production of Dropsite News. Jose Olivares produced this episode. This show is made possible in part by a grant from The Intercept. Our music, as always, was composed by DJ Spooky. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill.